Mr. President.
The senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
Yes.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I am again on this floor this afternoon because it is again apparent that Congress will fail to pass the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Congress will again fail to compensate those Americans who have been exposed by their own government to nuclear radiation, to nuclear testing, to nuclear waste. Why is Congress failing to act again? Well, because the House doesn't want to vote on it. The House doesn't want to vote on the radiation bill as part of the FAA. The House doesn't want to vote on the radiation bill as part of anything. The House just doesn't want to vote at all. The only problem with that, Mr. President, is there's only 1 month remaining before this vital program, this commitment that this nation has made to the working people of this nation, to the veterans of this nation who have served this country, before this commitment runs out, before it goes dark, before people exposed to nuclear waste by their own government get nothing. We have 1 month to go, and the House has not acted. And so I am here again to remind this Congress again why it is vital, why it is a moral imperative that Congress, the House in particular, act without delay. So, let me once more remind the House and all those listening of just a few of the stories of the good Americans who have given their health, and in many cases, I'm sad to say, their lives, in an effort to help this country's nuclear program, and as a result of what this country, what this government, what the military did in pushing forward with the nuclear program, including uranium processing and mining, without telling and informing the American people of what they were doing. Let me just start in the state of Missouri. I could start in any number of states because this was a nationwide effort that stretches all the way back to the Manhattan Project. And now most of America has seen that movie about Dr. Oppenheimer, which won all of those awards, and that's fine, and I'm sure Dr. Oppenheimer deserves all the credit, but let's just be clear that the real people who won not just the Second World War, the people who won the Cold War, the people who have fought and won every conflict that this nation has been involved in, the people who are truly responsible and get the credit for the success of the nation's nuclear program and military writ large are the working people of this country who were not featured in that movie, who have not won awards, who are not getting plaudits from Hollywood or Wall Street or anybody else, but are instead dying because of the radiation that their own government exposed them to. In St. Louis, the government opened a uranium processing site in the 1940s at the height of the Manhattan Project. St. Louis was a so-called secret city because it wasn't known that it was a site for uranium processing, and that went on for years. When the government finally decided to close down the site, they didn't dispose of the nuclear waste. Instead, they allowed that waste to leak out of trucks that were supposed to transport it. They set it out in barrels in a parking lot where it was exposed to the elements for years on end. Eventually, they ended up dumping it, or some of it, in a public landfill. You heard that right. Our government dumped nuclear waste in St. Louis into a public landfill, where, by the way, it still is. All these years later, it hasn't been cleaned up. And as for the rest of it, the nuclear waste that sat out in barrels exposed to the elements that was negligently transported in trucks, what happened to it? Well, it ran off into local creeks. It ran off into the soil. It helped pollute the air. And because of that, Mr. President, for 50 years and running, the people of St. Louis and St. Charles, which is right next door, and the entire region have been subjected to nuclear radiation in their homes, in their creeks, and yes, in their schools, and it is still happening today. What has the federal government done? Nothing. Nothing but mislead the people of my state. In fact, mislead is really too nice. They've out and out lied to them. The government said for years there was no nuclear contamination in Coldwater Creek in the St. Louis area. They said to the people of North County, St. Louis, your homes are fine. Your schools are fine. You're paranoid. Don't worry about it. It turns out that was all a lie. The soil was contaminated. The water is contaminated as I stand here tonight. And now we've got the Army Corps of Engineers testing underneath people's basements because that's how deep the nuclear radiation waste and contamination has sunk. That's how deeply embedded it now is, really in the entire region. And that story, Mr. President, has been repeated over and over in places from Tennessee to Kentucky to Alaska to New Mexico and Utah and Nevada and Wyoming and many another state in the West, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. Now, it's a pattern, Mr. President, because this government's refusal to take responsibility for what it did is a pattern that continues to this day, and it's time to break it. Because of what the government did, people like Zoe from St. Louis, she was born, this little girl, with a mass on her ovary, born with it. Why? Well, because her parents lived right near the creek that has been contaminated with nuclear radiation for decades and decades. She had to have surgery to remove that mass from her body when she was 3 weeks old. 3 weeks. She's 5 years old now, and she continues to experience regular complications from this disease that she was born with because of what the federal government did. She's not the only one, not by a stretch, long stretch. There's Zach Vizentine. Zach was born with a rare brain tumor, one known to be caused by radiation. He had his first surgery when he was 1 week old. He started chemotherapy when he was 3 weeks old. And Zach died when he was 6. Why? Well, because his parents lived in that same region of St. Louis, right along that creek that the government poisoned, right along that waterway that the government contaminated, right along that area where the government said for decades, totally fine, totally safe. People played in the water. They built their homes right along the creek. Schools were built there. It was contaminated the entire time. And now Zach's family is left to mourn. Or there's Claire. Claire's parents also grew up in the St. Louis area. Claire's parents grew up near another nuclear site called Weldon Spring, which is out in St. Charles, Missouri. For those who don't know the state, that's just to the west there of St. Louis. Claire was diagnosed as a baby with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma when she was only 2 years old. This is happening not just in Missouri. We could talk about the victims of the Trinity test, the original Oppenheimer test, like Bernice Gutierrez. Bernice was 8 days old when Trinity was detonated. 8 days. What we now know was, despite the government telling people at the time that there was no danger to their lives or property or persons, despite them saying it was fine, the nuclear fallout, the radiation, generated a cloud so large nearly the entire state of New Mexico was covered. And Bernice lived just miles from the test site. 44 members of Bernice's family, 44, have been diagnosed with cancer or radiation linked diseases. Her mother had cancer 3 times. 3 times. 3 of her brothers have had cancer. Her sister has had cancer, and she has a thyroid disease that is radiation induced. Her oldest son passed away from radiation illness. Her daughter died of thyroid cancer, and 36 additional relatives, have died of cancer and radiation-linked thyroid diseases. What has Bernice received from the United States government? An apology? Nope. Recognition? Nope. Compensation? Not a dime. Not a dime. Then there's Leslie Begay, who's a Navajo Marine. Leslie's so typical of so many of the Navajo Nation. Did you know the Navajo Nation volunteers to serve this country and our armed forces in a proportion greater than any other community in the United States of America? It's extraordinary. And when the time came during the Cold War to open mines, to mine for uranium, guess who did more mining than any other community in the United States of America? It was members of the Navajo Nation. You want to talk about patriots? These are patriots. They have served this nation at every hour of need. And Leslie is a prime example. What did Leslie get when he went to the uranium mines? This is after he served the country in the Marines now. He goes to the uranium mines to continue serving this country. Did the government support him? No. Did they warn him? No. Have they compensated him for the diseases and cancers he has suffered? No. No. Let me give you just one more example. These are young men and women, very young, elementary students at Jana Elementary School back in the St. Louis area. This picture was taken just a year or so ago. Their school was closed in 2022, closed because testing, independent, verified third-party testing discovered dangerous levels of radiation in the dust on the windowsills at the school, in the dust covering the desks at the school. Why is that? Because Jana Elementary sits right next to that contaminated creek that the government poisoned all those years ago. And now these kids are told not only can they not go to school any longer in the neighborhood where they grew up, for months they were without a school entirely, now they're told, who knows what they've been exposed to? Who knows? What has the government done about it? Have they rebuilt the school? No. Have they cleaned it up? No. Have they helped any of these children? No. It's the same story. And I could give you 6 more examples, or 60,000, or 600,000, because that's the minimum number of the good Americans who have been poisoned by their government, exposed by their government and the government's negligence to nuclear radiation. Now, I will say this, Mr. President. The Senate did the right thing just a couple of months ago when we finally passed legislation to right this decades-long injustice. This body finally passed, by an overwhelming bipartisan margin, I might add, legislation to compensate these families, to compensate these good Americans, these brave Americans, to acknowledge them and their service, to elevate them to the stature that they deserve. These are American heroes. They deserve to be honored. They deserve to be elevated. They deserve to be compensated. This legislation, our legislation, would do it, and this body has passed it. And now it waits for action in the House. Now, Speaker Johnson said, upon passage of the Senate's legislation 2 months ago, I have his statement in front of me. He said that he would work to move forward and act on the reauthorization measure. Move forward and act on a reauthorization measure. That was March of 2024. This is May. What has the House done? Nothing. How has the House voted? Not at all. What action has the House taken? None. And in 1 month, if the House does not act, this program goes dark. These children are not helped. These good Americans are not compensated. 1 month to go. So I say again today, it is time for Speaker Johnson to keep his commitment, not to some politician somewhere. It's his job to keep his commitment to the American people. It's his job to keep his commitment to the good people of this nation who are waiting for him to act. And I will just say that weakness in the face of injustice is not commendable. Vacillation in the face of injustice is not to be praised. Indecision in the face of injustice is nothing to be proud of. This is the time to act and to move. This is the time for the House to keep its commitments and for the Speaker to keep his commitments. We need politicians who are less concerned about how long they'll hold their office and how many votes they have to support them in some election for office, and more concerned about delivering justice for the American people. Now I'll say this. I know there are some in the Speaker's party, my party, who would urge him to turn back and to reject what this body did in honoring and compensating the American people who so deserve it. I see these remarks from today, published. Remarks made by the junior senator from Utah, Senator Romney. Here's what Senator Romney said. He does not like The bill passed by the Senate compensating these Americans. He says it costs too much. And he goes on and says that any compensation should be reserved for people, I'm quoting now, who have been determined to actually be suffering. To actually be suffering as a result of radiation exposure. I have to tell you, I don't understand this statement at all. I do not understand it. I do not understand why it's not good enough for these children and their suffering to matter. I don't understand why the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Americans poisoned in my state and other states, why that isn't good enough for this body to act. We have evidence, we have studies. This has been years of research done on the scope of the government's tests, on the scope of the downwind exposure to radiation, on the uranium processing done in Missouri and in Tennessee and Kentucky and so many other states, Ohio. We know what the facts are. That's why this body finally acted. And I would just say to the Speaker, it is incumbent now on you to act. Do not turn back and do not listen to those who would tell you to put people last and money first. Make no mistake, the bill for this program has been paid. The bill for this radiation has been paid. It's been paid by the American people. They're the ones who are paying the costs. They're the ones who are dying. They're the ones who are having to forego cancer treatments, treatments for their children, because they can't afford it, because their government has exposed them to this radiation negligently and now won't do anything about it. They're paying the cost. It's time the government bore its share. Now, this is a moment of truth for Congress and also for the party of which I am a member. It's a moment of decision. If you want to be the party of working people, you have to stand up for working people. If you want to be the party of those who have fought and died and bled and given their health for this country, you have to stand up for them. This is the time. This is the time. This is a test, Mr. President, and it is time for my party to rise to it, along with the rest of this Congress, to honor the people who have built this nation. So yes, Mr. President, I am in earnest about it. And yes, I do feel a heaviness of heart about this today because, yes, the clock is ticking. I know that the lives that we have lost, we can never get back. I realize that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't act now to help those who are suffering now. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't act now to right the wrong. It was wrong for the government to poison the American people, lie to them about it, and do nothing about it. That was wrong, but we can right that wrong. This is America. We can make it right. The bill the Senate passed makes it right. This is a moral matter. It is a moral commitment. I call on the House to act without delay. I call on them to do the right thing without hesitation. I urge the Speaker, do what's right for the American people. Do what's right for the working people of this nation. If you do, the nation will commend you and stand with you. Courage in the service of justice is what we need now, and I urge him toward it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.